Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to our special series at the Jerusalem International Writers Festival on the power of responsibility. It is a great pleasure and privilege to us to have been involved in Jerusalem International Writers Festival here at the Mishkenot Sha'ananim from its very beginning in 2008. As a political foundation, our aim is to create a platform for dialogue and discussion. Literature is not created in a vacuum. In one way or the other, it will always reflect a reality in which it has been created. That is why it is so important for us to host panel discussions of social-political orientation, examining the power of literature to influence social and political changes of local and global significance. Just a couple of words about the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We are a German political foundation with the vision to promote international dialogue, sustainable development, good governance, capacity building, regional integration, and enhance understanding of the key drivers of global developments. We are named after the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Konrad Adenauer. His name represents the democratic rebuilding of Germany, reconciliation with France, the anchoring of German foreign policy in a transatlantic community of values, the establishment of the unique relationship between Israel and Germany as well as with the European Union, and of course the vision of European unity and Germany's orientation towards a social market economy. In its mission statement, the KAS commits itself to preserving and developing the close friendship between Israel and Germany. Therefore, KAS Israel mainly works on deepening the relations between both countries and between Israel and the EU in the field of foreign and security policy as well as social and economic policy by emphasizing the common interests. We have an international network of a little bit more than 100 offices worldwide, and this year our office in Israel celebrates its 40th anniversary of activities. Israel is perhaps the most suitable place to examine the idea that we set as a motto for this year's series, the power of responsibility. Politics is part of everyday life and thus finds its way to art and literature. There is no doubt that literature is meant first and foremost to fill our spirits and minds with interest and joy. However, the question, what is the role and the responsibility of writers and thinkers towards their communities as well as towards global reality, especially in times of political crises we are facing now, is inevitable. This is exactly what our unique events at the Writers' Festival will try to achieve, featuring a dialogue between great writers and thinkers of our time, whom I thank sincerely for their participation. And let me also thank the Mishkenot Sha'ananim and its wonderful team very cordially. It is a privilege to cooperate with such an outstanding partner. I wish you all a fruitful and meaningful discussion. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the 10th Jerusalem Writers Festival in Mishkenot Sha'ananim. This event is part of a special series on the power of responsibility, which was organized in collaboration with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Israel and is dedicated to examining the relationships between power, state, economy, and climate in the 21st century. Questions of responsibility and power have stood at the core of ongoing discussions for centuries and are, of course, the theme of many classic and modern novels and books. But it seems like in recent decades, such questions have, at least to some extent, changed their forms. If in the past, moral responsibility pertained mostly to our immediate surroundings, towards one's partner, parents, siblings, and so on and so forth, perhaps the neighborhood or fellow citizens in some cases, in modern time, we are faced with questions of responsibility towards humanity as a whole, as well as other animals inhabiting this planet and even the planet itself. So today we will try to dive deep into such questions of global responsibility, asking what we as individuals can and should do as part of that responsibility. And for this discussion, I am thrilled and excited to host two prominent thinkers who already left a huge mark on the world in their ideas and actions. Professor Pitter Singher, a renowned moral philosopher, who is often credited with starting the modern animal rights movement and the author of several books, of which the best known may be Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, and The Life You Can Save. The last of these books has given rise to a charity with the same name that provides information about and encourages people to donate to charities that are the most highly effective in saving or improving the lives of people in extreme poverty. And our own Professor Yuval Noah Harari, historian, probably one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world today. His books, Sapiens, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and Sapiens, A Graphic History, have sold nearly 40 million copies. His recent article on the invasion of Ukraine has become The Guardian's most read op-ed of all time. And a new book series for children, Unstoppable Us, is expected to be published worldwide this autumn. In all these writings, Yuval has made moral claims about our commitment to the well-being of others, which we will discuss here. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Perhaps we could start with defining the boundaries of responsibility. Where do you draw them? I am clearly responsible to the well-being of my family. Am I also responsible for the well-being of every creature on Earth, to the well-being of the planet, of the universe even? Like, could we draw a boundary here?
I think ultimately we are responsible for everything that we could do to help other sentient beings, whether human or non-human, whether they're in my own country or somewhere else in the world. And for that matter, whether they're living now or will live in centuries to come. The limits to our responsibility are firstly our abilities to change things, and to change things for the better is obviously what we should be doing. And the limits of our knowledge, which may mean that we don't know how certain interventions will pan out, that's particularly relevant when we're talking about the future, but it may also be relevant to some extent when we're talking about people who are part of a different culture in another country. There are many examples where we've thought that we could help, but we haven't. So it's really important to inform yourself and know that you are actually going to help in the way that the people you're trying to help want to be helped.
I completely agree. I think that our responsibility extends as far as our power extends. And one of the problems we face is this mismatch between our power and our knowledge, that over thousands of years, the power of human beings increased enormously, but our knowledge is not catching up. And that space there in between, opening between our power and our knowledge, that's the dangerous space.
Can you explain a bit more? Because in a way, I would say our knowledge expanded tremendously, what we know, the things that we know how to do about technology, about physics.
But you know, it's much easier to build a dam over a river than to understand the full consequences, to know the full consequences for the fish, for the birds, for the trees, for the climate, for us. So we have the power to, very often in history, we get the power to build dams before we get the full knowledge of what are the consequences. And it's even doubly true on the individual level. Now I'm connected through chains, causal chains, to everything that's happening around the world. But to investigate even one simple thing, like where does this shirt come from, and which humans or animals may have suffered in the production of this shirt, it would take me literally years to really know the full consequences of buying this shirt.
And might I dare and add, maybe people just don't care. So we are very good in feeling responsibility towards people who are like us and animals who are like us maybe, but the farther away the subject of responsibility is in time, in space, in similarity, then the less responsibility we feel.
Yes, but there are also clearly limits to how much we can care for all of these different things. And you know, I may also not have investigated exactly who made this shirt and what the consequences were for them and others around them. If somebody were to convince me that I was doing something really bad by buying this shirt or similar shirts, maybe I would try to find out more. but we all have our priorities. And you know, there are certain things that I've tried to do where I've acquired some expertise, things relating to the treatment of animals and the consequences of eating them, things relating to what we can do to help people in extreme poverty through donating to effective charities. But there simply isn't time to inform myself properly about every consumer item that I might wear or buy or use in some way.
Yeah, and that's really quite a novel problem in history, because if we go back, say, I don't know, to the Stone Age, so the type of life that humans lived for most of their evolution, it didn't involve these kinds of ethical questions. I mean, as a hunter-gatherer, you know most of the consequences of what you do because it's very, very local. It's the people and animals immediately around you. It's very rare that you do something which has a significant impact on a distant place or on unfamiliar people and animals. So in a way, you know, from an evolutionary perspective, maybe our ethical sense or our ethical instincts did not evolve to deal with the type of ethical questions that we are now facing in the 21st century. So we still try to deal ethically the same way as our ancestors, but the actual situation is completely different.
I think it might also relate Go ahead.
Although you've pointed out that our ancestors or indigenous peoples also didn't always know the consequences of what they were doing. I'm speaking to you from Australia, and as you know, when humans came to Australia, they wiped out something like 90% of the large mammals in the country. And I'm sure they didn't know that. They didn't know that by the number that they were killing, they were going to leave fewer animals to hunt for their ancestors. But it happened nevertheless.
But today, I would... Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Of course, it happened over thousands of generations. I think that the main difference is that they really were not in a position to understand the long-term consequences of what they were doing. We, at least collectively, we are in a position to do it. We have the ability to understand what we are doing to the planet, to the climate, to other animals. It's just that to do it, we need to rely on collective institutions that gather the knowledge and analyze it and so forth. And this is very difficult for us. I mean, ethically, we tend to rely on ourselves, but to deal with problems of this magnitude, we basically need to rely on these huge institutions, which feels alienated, and this is part of the reason for the deep ethical crisis we're facing.
But I think that on the other hand, we might, our ethical reflexes, if you like, have also expanded in the sense that, you know, if I'm a Neanderthal, I don't know what's happening in the Ukraine. There wasn't a Ukraine there, but I don't know what's happening in another side of the world. But now today, I get information about human suffering in this case that is not related to my well-being here or now, or to the people I know. And I develop this empathy muscle, if you like, and I can relate to that. And I would like to do things for other people around the world. So maybe modernity also led to an expansion of our moral responsibility, of our empathy, and not only to kind of getting us into this very complicated stage where we don't even know some of what are the practical, you know, implications and ethical implications of our doing.
I think our understanding of the world as a whole has extended our empathy to some degree, obviously still to a far too limited degree. We're still not doing nearly enough, I believe, to help people in extreme poverty. And we had another example of that just now during the COVID crisis, in that the affluent countries everybody got 2 vaccines if they wanted it, then they got a booster. But in some low-income countries, the percentage of people who'd had even 1 vaccination was very low. And we were not doing enough to make the vaccines available all around the world, even though actually that was in our own interest to stop new variants developing. But we still didn't do it. We still thought about the short term and ourselves.
So let's talk about... Go ahead.
No, please. No.
Zoom is difficult in that respect.
Yes.
Okay, so let's continue that. So let's talk about poverty. And if I remember correctly, Yuval, from your book, in a way, we are, historically speaking, in the best position that we've ever been with respect to poverty. Is that correct?
In respect to the resources we have, I mean, for much of history, poverty was a kind of, and the effects of poverty, such as famine, and such as infectious diseases and epidemics spreading, they were like uncontrollable forces of nature. Humanity simply did not have the scientific knowledge and the economic resources to overcome things like famine and plague. Every now and then there would be like a drought, and there just won't be enough food. And there was no technological means to bring food from far away because it was too complicated and expensive. And with epidemics, even more so, nobody knew anything about viruses or pathogens, let alone vaccines. Now, for really the first time in history, these are no longer uncontrollable forces of nature. They are now manageable challenges. We have the scientific knowledge, the technology, and the economic resources to make sure that no human being dies from starvation, or no human being dies from a long list of infectious diseases. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean we always have the wisdom and the compassion to use these resources. So on the one hand, we're in the best of times. At least we have now it's in our power, we can solve it. On the other hand, if we don't do it, it's an even bigger tragedy. Because, when it's a natural disaster that you can't help, then what can you do? It's beyond our power. But when it's something you can prevent, and you don't do it because you lack the wisdom or because you lack the compassion, that's a far bigger tragedy.
It seems to me like a direct continuation of what you said before, that now we are in the position that allows us to get the information or to act upon it, but many of us choose not to. And I want to maybe direct this question to you, Peter. Where, in your opinion, is our blind spots with respect to poverty? What is it that we just don't see or choose not to see?
Well, I think mostly what we choose not to see is how relatively easily we can make a big difference to the lives of people in extreme poverty. Because when I talk to people about poverty elsewhere in the world, people who have no particular background in this area, they're likely to say, oh yes, I know that there are a lot of people who are very poor and their lives are very tough, but how can we help them? I think the money never reaches them. It's like pouring it down a black hole. I think people say to me things like that. And I think the blind spot, therefore, is knowledge of how relatively easily and for relatively modest sums of money, we can make a big difference to the lives of people in poverty. We can, in some cases, we can save their lives by distributing bed nets so they don't get malaria, and children particularly die from malaria. Or we can restore their sight if they're blind because they have cataracts, which in affluent countries we would all get removed very simply and inexpensively. But there are people who just can't afford to get their cataracts removed. And there's a lot of other opportunities people don't have because they are living on less than $2 a day and they can't save up the money to have a little bit of capital to start a small business. That's just too much risk. If it goes wrong, they won't eat. So people don't realize that it's quite modest sums of money when we're talking about that. If people are living on less than $2 a day, which is the World Bank's extreme poverty line, and you give them $1,000, you've given them more than their annual income. And that, of course, makes a huge difference to their lives in various ways. Whereas when we're helping people at home, and of course, a lot of people say, well, I think charity begins at home. But if the poverty line, say, is $20,000, as it is in the United States for a family anyway, a bit over that, and you give them $1,000, it's not going to be life-changing. It might make them a little more comfortable for a while, but it's not going to be life-changing in the way that it will be for somebody for whom it's their entire annual income. And I think people, I'm not sure whether they don't know that or they, look away or they don't believe it because then they would feel more of an obligation to get serious and not just throw a few coins into tin when it's rattled under their nose. So that, to me, that's the thing that we need to try to get across to people.
I think that, again, part of the problem here goes back to the institutions and the lack of trust in institutions, because many people would say if with $1,000 I could save the life of a person or the eyesight of a child, then yes, I would gladly do it. But I can't do it myself. It's not like I'm personally going there to give the money, or I'll direct transfer the money to some bank account. There is always an institution in between. And a lot of people, they, especially in our time, they develop this deep mistrust and cynicism about institutions. No, it's just some sham. All the money goes to the executives. It's corrupt. And I think in this case too, like with the issues we dealt with before, in the end, it's largely a question of how do you build trust in institutions? Because most ideals, in order to be realized, you can't do it individually. You can do it individually if it's in your neighborhood, like to go visit a sick neighbor or in your family. But globally, the only thing that really works is institutions. And for that, people need to trust institutions. And I think one of the major ethical problems or dilemmas we are facing in 2022 is lack of trust and actually deteriorating trust in institutions, which reverberates into so many moral issues and really moral catastrophes.
Isn't that, Peter, exactly what isn't that exactly, Peter, what your charity tries to do? The Life You Can Save, exactly to tell people how their money can be used specifically for a certain reason, a cause, and to overcome this distrust that Yuval is talking about?
Yes, exactly, that's right. What we're trying to show is that there are independently assessed charities that have been evaluated to be highly effective and to make the best possible use of any donation they receive. And if people go to the website of The Life You Can Save, thelifeyoucansave.org, and click on Best Charities, they'll find the list of those charities. And if they click on a button to donate, 100% of what they donate will go to those charities. None of it will go to The Life You Can Save. We have some donors who do donate to The Life You Can Save so that we can keep operating and keep spreading knowledge about these effective charities. But if you're choosing to donate to one of our recommended, there's about 24 or something, I think, on the list, to one of those, it'll all go there. So we hope that people can trust the organization and that they can trust the kind of evaluation. The evaluators don't have any interest in it either, and feel confident that what they're donating is really being highly effective.
And I think that that's a very good example that, especially in a situation where we are flooded by enormous amounts of information, what we need is institutions that curate information and curate other institutions, like list of recommendations. So we have it on Netflix or other streaming giants. There are when I was a kid, there was just one channel. So whatever is on TV, you watch it, that's it. Now there are so many TV series, you need a recommendation list. It becomes very central. So it's the same with, it's the same with the news, that what a newspaper does is basically curate information. And you also need it with charities, that you need another institution that recommends to you which institutions you can trust. And then the question is, how do you learn to trust this institution? And there is no way to bypass it. Any attempt to bypass institutions and say, no, we don't need institutions, we'll just have some blockchain technology which will do it, it doesn't work. The real important, difficult, but really crucial work is to build institutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And even with the internet, we have places like Kiva where you can see a particular person who you want to donate to. But, that's not more reliable, because obviously there are some people who will take advantage of that and will pretend to be someone they're not to receive donations that way. So I agree, you do need an institution that you can trust.
But it's interesting because Yuval, it seems as if the picture that you're drawing here shows that in recent times, with the rich amount of information that we are exposed to at all times, we need institutions more. But from what I kind of think and read in recent decades, it seems as if there has been a public surge against institutions. Like the social media is supposed to take the edge off the traditional newspapers who hold the monopoly on giving us the information. So it seems as if these are two contradicting trends, isn't it?
That's the problem. I mean, we need institutions actually more, but there is this wave of distrust against them. Now, it doesn't mean we need the old institutions. It doesn't mean that we have to stick with the old media. Maybe we need new media institutions, which will be more diverse, which will give more people a chance to voice their opinions. But in the end, we will need to build these new institutions. The idea that we can just do without them, that we'll have just this free market of ideas and anybody can say anything, and we don't want institutions to kind of stand in the middle and curate and decide what is reliable and what is not reliable. This doesn't work. It's been tried so many times in history. You know, if you look at religious history, to take a counterexample, so you have in Christianity, again and again, these people coming and saying, you know, we don't want the Catholic Church, this institution. Let's just, every person can read the Bible for himself and know the truth. What is more simple than that? Why do we need an institution? And you have the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And within 20 years or 50 years, they realize that when you let every person read the Bible for themselves, you get 100 different interpretations, radically different. So eventually someone comes and says, no, these are the correct interpretations, and you get the Lutheran Church. And after 100 years, someone says, wait, but the whole idea of the Reformation was to get rid of the church. So we don't want the Lutheran Church. Let every person just read the Bible and understand by themselves. And you have chaos, and after 50 years, you have the Baptist Church and this church, and that you always go back to institutions. So it's the same with the kind of information explosion that we have right now.
So let's try and think how we can apply that to philanthropy or to moral responsibility. And we mentioned before the charity that tries to do exactly that, to be like the gatekeeper or the information provider that would help people to be more effective in their altruism. And I think maybe that's a good point to also mention the paper you wrote, Pitter, Famine, Affluence and Morality, which inspired, though much later, this idea or movement of effective altruism. Maybe you can explain a bit to our viewers what effective altruism is.
Yes, certainly. So obviously people will know what altruism is. They know that it's wanting to do good for others. And that's been around for a long time. But the emphasis on effectiveness is what is new about the effective altruism movement. And it's really people who are trying to find out what are the best causes to donate to, and within those causes, what are the best organizations to support? And it's become a quite extensive debate with a lot of different voices. You can find a lot of it online. Some people, as I've been saying, think that trying to help people in extreme poverty is one of the most effective things you can do. Others, and I share this view to some extent as well, think that trying to stop the suffering of animals, particularly the billions and tens of billions of animals now existing in industrial factory farms, to try to reduce their suffering, is a very effective use of money if what we're concerned with is reducing as much suffering as we can. Other people take a more long-term view and point to the risks that our species will become extinct. And even if those risks are small, they point out that the costs of extinction are very huge, not only in the 8 billion people who might die if an asteroid were to collide with our planet right now, but also in the loss of all future lives, which they would see as having immense value. And possibly, our species could exist for millions, tens of millions, maybe even in a billion or more years. So if we were to become extinct, that would not happen. Maybe there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, but doesn't seem to be anywhere really close to us at the moment, certainly hasn't made contact with us. So they see that as a great loss. And that's another direction that effective altruists have been going in.
Maybe I would just add to that we just need to be careful not to turn this into an argument about what is the most effective. There is room for everybody. If somebody thinks that the most effective is to take care of animal suffering, and somebody else thinks, no, we should help people in poverty, I mean, focus on doing what you think is most effective. Don't try to convince the other guys that they are wrong. I mean, there is enough for everybody.
Well, yes, but that's not actually, I must admit, what's been happening in the effective altruism movement. Some of the people like to have these debates, and I don't think it's illegitimate. I suppose it's
legitimate. Say, it's just
yeah. I mean, what they would say is we have a limited amount of resources, right? I mean, let's say if I want to donate, and if I'm giving my money to people in extreme poverty, then I'm not giving to organizations combating factory farming. So actually, I do a bit of both there because I find it very hard to compare those two. But other people would say, why aren't you donating to try to reduce the risk of extinction? And I'm not, and I say, well, it's good that there's some money going into that. I agree. I'm glad that you and a few others are doing this. But at the moment, it still seems highly speculative how we can make these differences, at least in some areas, maybe not all areas, but some of the areas that they talk about. It's questionable whether we really know enough at this stage to reduce some of the extinction risks that they're concerned about.
But maybe this is another reason why many people don't choose to act, in line with their responsibility obligation, if you might. Maybe there's just this feeling that there are so many ways by which we can make the world better. There are so many problems. Maybe that has a paralyzing force. Maybe just that causes us not to do anything because there's just too many things and we cannot resolve all of them.
I think that would be a pity if that happens, both because people then wouldn't do as much good, but also I think even for themselves, if people get involved in some of these issues and feel that they are achieving something, it adds meaning to their lives. I think a lot of us in this material world, particularly people who've been reasonably successful at providing for themselves and their family in material terms, lack a sense of purpose. Once you've got enough to look after yourself, what do you do then? Well, I think finding a cause that is really worthwhile, where you know that you can do a lot of good, is probably the best thing that you can do then, obviously for those you're doing good to, but also for yourself.
I agree that the best is choose one thing. Obviously, you can't do everything. Nobody can do everything. So instead of being paralyzed and overwhelmed by all these different issues, just choose one issue which is close to your heart, and then try to choose compassionately. Because again, going back to some of the historical issues with altruism and with ethics, sometimes I'm so not surprised because it's so common in history. But you see people that they focus, they try to do good through the most controversial or most kind of, I'll give an example. Like you're a Christian fundamentalist, and you can choose whether to help the poor or whether to fight against gay marriage, and you choose to fight against gay marriage. Why? I mean, obviously you can't do everything. So why not choose the kind of something that everybody would agree, nobody would become upset about you? Why choose the one thing that is bound to at least cause controversy and that could cause a lot of suffering to some? Why not go for the safe pick of just going to a hospital and helping sick people?
Well, you surely have an answer. Like, you know why they are doing that, don't you? They feel it threatens their worldview, that it jeopardizes the way we should live, and so on and so forth. Like, they will give you arguments why this is the most important fight to have.
That's the issue. I mean, let's not go into the argument, but let's assume that you have a Christian worldview and you think it's wrong. Yeah. Still, as an individual, you can't do everything. So for all the good Christian deeds that you can do, why choose this one thing? And maybe look into your mind or look into your soul if you believe you have a soul and try to see, why did I really choose this particular thing, which would almost inevitably involve a lot of anger and hatred and controversies, where I could, I can just leave this aside because I can't do everything and focus on helping sick people in hospital or helping poor people.
Yeah, I think we've had similar debates on other issues with Christians too. In Australia, we've had over the last 2 or 3 years a lot of debates about legislation to allow people to choose to die when they're terminally ill. And obviously that's, like gay marriage, that's adults consenting, a person who wants to die and a doctor who's prepared to help that person to die. And we have now in most of the Australian states legalized that, but it took quite a battle and Christians were in the forefront of opposing it, although it seems to me that it clearly reduces suffering and it doesn't harm people who don't want it. Nobody is being forced to choose assisted dying. So it is perplexing. I mean, maybe they think it's a slippery slope that is beginning or something like that, but we've had a lot of experience with assisted dying over the last 40 years, starting off with the Netherlands, and it hasn't produced these terrible predicted slippery slopes. So I think it's strange that people should put a lot of energy into fighting things that competent adults are choosing and doesn't seem to really harm anybody.
I can understand why they oppose it. What I find kind of objectionable is the immense amount of energy invested in it. I mean, there are so many people who want to live, and you can help them live. And that instead of focusing on the relatively few cases of people in extreme suffering and so forth who want to die, and you pour your resources into preventing them. No, there are so many people who really want to live, but they don't have enough food or they don't have enough medicine, and you can really save them by pouring the resources there. So wouldn't it be kind of easier and more compassionate for everybody? Just focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I guess history is filled with cases where people don't go along the routes that you're suggesting to them and choose to fight those battles that you're here fighting against. And as a historian, you probably have an explanation to why that happens.
Yeah, I mean, the suspicion is that there is something other than compassion that dominates. It's not, I mean, when people make these kinds of choices, it's not really that they think of all the things I can do in the world. This is the most compassionate thing. It's usually either there are political interests involved, or there are all kinds of dark psychological forces like hatred and bigotry, which are involved. And again, going with their worldview, it could be that there is some mixture, that there is some compassion there as well. But it's compassion kind of diluted with a lot of hatred and anger, and not the pure form of compassion. And we know that people sometimes, that they are almost addicted to this righteous anger, to proving that they are better than others, to having these arguments about who is right and who is wrong, instead of focusing on, okay, you believe in a particular worldview, do what's right according to it, instead of fighting with everybody about why you are more correct than they are.
But that you can find also in the type of initiative that you two have been involved in. For example, if maybe we can move to the fight towards animal rights. Here you have people who strongly fight to convince everyone else that they're wrong and that they shouldn't eat animals, hurt animals, and so on and so forth. So this righteous anger exists there as well, doesn't it?
It does exist, but it is, I think, it can be based in compassion and concern for those animals and to the vast amount of suffering that we humans inflict on animals. And I know Yuval agrees with me because he very kindly wrote a preface to my book, Animal Liberation, to a recent edition, in which he said that what we do to animals, particularly in industrial farms, is perhaps the worst crime that humanity has committed. And I was very moved by those words. But so I think if we're talking about scale of suffering, it's very reasonable to be focused on animals. The one thing that I would say is that it's true that some people in the animal rights movement get rather fanatical about what you might think of as purity. So they're very careful not to let any kind of animal product into their body, for example, and will attack people who do. And that seems to me to be missing the point in a way similar to that, what Yuval was talking about. You know, you focus on something that somebody has done when in fact there are so much bigger issues, so much more suffering that you could prevent if you targeted other targets.
I completely agree. If you have an animal rights activist that, you know, somebody says that, okay, I decided to have a meatless Monday. I don't eat meat on Monday. And then you attack them, but what about all the other days of the week? I don't think that's the way to go. If somebody makes a step in the right direction, focus on the positive thing. And also something very, very general, people have an obsession with food. And it connects also to very old notions of purity and pollution, that you find people that can go to extremes, not to eat any tiny particle of something that came, even a honey that came from bees or whatever. But then other things which are not food, like I don't know, what's involved in the textile industry or in other industry, it gets completely left aside. I think we should have a broader view of the type of impact we have on animals and on the ecological system, and not become just kind of tunnel vision just on food. And the danger there is you see in so many different ways that, I mean, it's just, I don't know, something about humans or maybe mammals. We are obsessed with what we put into our mouths. Other things that we do, that's less important. Again, you also see it in religions that very often the last thing that remains from religion is food taboos. Like you have Jews, they don't believe in God, they don't go to synagogue, nothing, but they won't eat pork. That's the last holdout. Or they will fast on Yom Kippur. That's the last holdout, because food is really, and I think we need to get over it. Yes, food is important, but don't give it so much importance.
Yes, and in particular, the purity of it is not important, right? I mean, if you are a vegetarian or vegan, and you go to somewhere where there's a meat-based stock for the soup or something like that, but it's not really significant in terms of support for the industry. What I try and look at is, am I supporting this industry of abuse in a significant way? Am I buying products, which means that therefore more of these factory farm chickens are going to be produced and live miserable lives and then be slaughtered in the supermarkets? So I'm not going to do that. But if there's a tiny amount of some animal product in something that I'm eating, I'm not going to refuse to eat it if that's what's being put in front of me.
So what is the moral imperative in your opinion? Now I'm here, I'm listening to you, I'm writing notes. Give me the recipe for, being compassionate, being morally responsible for the well-being of others, as given the assumption that we can do everything. What in your opinion is like the minimal things that I, as an informed human being, should do when I conduct myself in the world?
Well, as I was saying, I think if you're middle class or above citizen of an affluent country, you've got some money to spare, and you should be thinking about using some of that to help people in extreme poverty. It's very hard to say how much. It varies, of course, not just with income, but with the dependents you have and so on. But, the traditional 10% tithe is not a bad standard to aim at if you're, as I say, at that above middle class level. So that's a start. I think you should be responsible for what you're eating, but as I say, in terms of the large quantities, and if you take various steps that don't go all the way, I'm not going to be that critical. So Yuval talked about having Meatless Mondays. Well, if yes, start off there, and if that works well, you might have Meatless Thursdays as well, and move on. You don't need it. I mean, when my wife and I first became aware of the suffering of animals more than 50 years ago, we decided to stop buying factory farm products. That was our first step. And we continued to eat meat for a little while. And then we decided, well, we didn't really need it. We'd found other dishes. And We didn't really know that the other animals were really being well treated. Probably they weren't in some other respects, even if not as bad as factory farming. So we stopped. And I think that's, I think it's fine to take those gradual steps, but in general, try not to support a system that is both inflicting great suffering on animals and is not producing more food anyway, because factory farming just wastes the food that we have to feed to those animals, and has climate change implications and possibly pandemic implications as well. So try to contribute to changing the world food system. I think that's a really important thing to do. And then, of course, there's the general things about trying to be a decent person to those around you. Obviously, I don't want to neglect those and think that it's only distant strangers and animals that we ought to be concerned about.
So maybe I'll say that I think morality is mainly about suffering. It's not about obeying this or that set of laws coming from above or coming from below or wherever. Morality is about being aware of suffering and what we can do to alleviate it. And the other thing is that morality tends towards moderation and not extremism. And one of the big problems in the history of morality, that in so many movements, people have both secular and religious. People confuse morality with extremism. That the more extreme you are, the better person you are. You see it in so many different movements. And as a kind of first approximation, no, it's the other way around. Morality tends towards moderation. So again, not always, not in every case, but generally speaking, if you want to start with assuming that morality tends more towards moderation and not towards extreme.
Thank you. I think both of these are very good recipes, so to speak, for the way we should conduct ourselves. And I want to ask about global trends or historical trends. And I would actually ask you, Peter, although you're not the historian in the room, because you wrote the book Animal Liberation in 1975. Yuval, I think you weren't even born there.
76,
so,
yeah.
Yes. So you have almost lifelong experience of working on this topic and also seeing how the world and society have changed towards that topic. I wanted to ask you if you see a change. So do you feel that people are more informed, or at the end of the day, maybe the group of people who are strongly devoted to it has expanded, but society at large didn't really change its position towards animal suffering?
I think there has been significant change in many countries, but not, unfortunately, worldwide. And I think people have changed a reasonable number. We're seeing that recently with the rise in availability of vegan foods, of plant-based protein, and more people becoming vegan, or anyway close to vegan, and so restaurants have far more vegan options than they used to. I mean, I think all that's interesting, and it does go along with a different and better attitude to animals. And the other thing I'd say is that in a number of countries, the European Union countries would be the major ones, there have been significant legislative improvements in the way animals are kept in factory farms. So the worst of the battery cages, for example, for hens when they couldn't even spread their wings, they are illegal in Europe now and have been for some time. And in fact, the European Commission is saying it's wanting to move to get rid of cages altogether. And so that will apply to breeding sows, to veal calves, who are also in very small pens. And that's happening to some extent in the United States as well. There's about 9 or 10 states that have enacted laws somewhat similar to the European Union's laws. So those are good, positive things. But you have to counterbalance them with the fact that as China has become more prosperous, its citizens are eating far more meat than they used to. And to provide that, there's been this enormous expansion of factory farming of a kind that we've not really seen in Western countries. So there are now 8 or 10 story buildings filled with thousands and thousands of pigs. They're never getting to go outside. They're very closely confined. China has virtually no animal welfare laws, no national animal welfare laws at all. So it's a grim situation, and that's why I can't say that the situation of animals is markedly better now than it was in 1975, although it's certainly more varied, and some of the thinking about animals that is reasonably common today was very rare in 1975.
Yuval, if we widen the scale, would you say that humanity becomes more moral and more compassionate with time? Or am I too optimistic here?
It
Not
goes,
really.
most of the big changes in history are not uniform. I mean, you see positive and negative developments side by side, and they don't kind of add up or cancel each other so you can reach the bottom line. No, I mean, there are very positive developments, like you see the feminist revolution and the very fast changes and positive changes in attitudes towards gender and towards women. And at the same time, you see the ecological crisis, and it's happening at the same time. And they don't cancel each other, they don't add up. It's just the way it is. Over the long term, I think we can't say that there is any marked improvement in human morality, if you think in terms of thousands of years. Because even the very real achievements of the last century, let's say, they're just the last century. And who knows what's waiting for us in 10 or 20 or 50 years. This could be just a very small blip in history. So looking at the large scale perspective, we can say that you can see some things in history are very, very clear. Humanity is becoming more and more powerful. Over thousands of years, this is absolutely clear. Humanity is becoming more and more unified, not in the sense that everybody agree or there are no wars, but everything becomes just a single system. From a situation with thousands of independent, isolated tribes, we now have one global system. This is very, very clear. But we can't say that we see any clear improvement in human morality or any clear improvement in happiness either. We are not significantly happier. There is no clear trend towards better lives over thousands of years.
But would you say that we became more attuned to suffering? Because as you, I think, repeatedly argued, our laws have changed their focus. And if in the past our laws might have been dictated by the king's ruling or the Bible, now many of our laws focus on human suffering. So we want to minimize suffering also in the rationalization of our judicial system.
Again, it depends who we are. I mean, if you look only, let's say, at Western countries over the last century, then yes, there is a very significant improvement. But if you look at the whole of humanity over the last 1,000 years, I'm not so sure. And you see, maybe the pendulum just swings far between extremes. That you look at the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, and they have reached depth of cruelty that have maybe not have been reached anywhere previously in human history. And again, the last few decades, the pendulum swung in a positive direction. But now it's last few years, it's again swinging in a very dangerous direction. And maybe in 20 or 50 years, we could have totalitarian regimes worse than anything we've seen in the 20th century. The people, if people survive, they would look and say, hey, it was just a short period between two really nasty totalitarian periods.
I certainly hope you're wrong about that.
I also hope I'm wrong. It's just a possibility. It's not a prophecy.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether you see any room for hope in the fact that at least people try to play lip service to the idea that they are not engaged in torture or not engaged in the murder of civilians. I mean, even Putin just said the bodies found in Bucha are fake news, put there by British intelligence, something of that sort. He's not saying, yes, that's what happens to Ukrainians. We want to get rid of them. So is that a sign of hope?
To some extent, yes, but Stalin also didn't go around publicizing the mass killings and taking journalists to visit the gulags to see what's really in there. And you also find when Putin is not speaking to foreign press, when there are internal Russian debates in the Russian media, I mean, not in closed doors, but in the Russian media, you now see publications which are really horrific in what they are saying publicly, again, within the public debate in Russia. And this could escalate very quickly. I mean, the Putin regime was not there 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So it's shifting, and it could shift to very dark places quite quickly. And again, part of the thing is that at present, still the most powerful economic and political and cultural force in the world is the Western powers and Western democracies. If they lose their economic and cultural dominance, which could happen quite quickly, then people in other places, even in the West, would feel less need to pay lip service to these kinds of ideals. Again, this is not, I'm not sure it will happen. I really hope it doesn't. Yeah. But it is, we should be realistic that it is a possibility, and it depends on us, on the decisions we take, of who we vote for, and what kind of institutions we support, and where we donate our money. I mean, it goes back to the beginning of this talk. I mean, there is no point making prophecies about the future as a kind of deterministic outcome. This is going to happen no matter what, because then what's the point? We can't do anything. There is a point in making, in highlighting dangerous scenarios if the message is, look, it's a danger, but we can still prevent it if we do this, if we do that. And we are still in the position that we can do something to prevent the worst case scenarios.
And we've inspected these processes from, the scale of decades and centuries and even thousands of years, even in this conversation. I want to zoom in to the last 2 years or 3 years and to talk just a little bit before we end this conversation about COVID and the way this might have affected people's sense of responsibility. Peter, you mentioned the difference between countries and what they can offer their citizens and the maybe lack of solidarity some of us felt towards people that cannot afford the vaccinations. And there have been also discussions about that. So do you think that this has been a maybe special test case for our ability to feel compassion towards others, to give up on what we need in order for others to get what they need?
Not, I think, on a global scale, possibly on a local scale, because certainly there were people who were trying to help others during the lockdowns. Melbourne had a lot of lockdowns. There were people who were offering younger people who were going to the supermarkets to do the shopping for older people who might have had difficulty doing it or were at more risk. Yes, there was, I think it strengthened senses of community solidarity. But as we were saying earlier, it didn't really do anything for global solidarity as far as I can see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree that it was, in a way, it was really disheartening to see the lack of global solidarity, because this should have been kind of an easy test. That if you want to test global solidarity, what's easier than a global pandemic that, it threatens all of us? It's obvious that as long as the pandemic keeps spreading in one country, it poses a threat to all the other countries because of the mutations and so forth. And it's not a human enemy. So, it's all of us humans uniting against this terrible virus. What could have been easier? It didn't happen. I mean, the last 2 years, it's been a scientific triumph, but a political failure. Because
I just wanted to say that in science it did happen. So in science you did see outstanding collaboration that goes way beyond what we typically see when labs sometimes compete one another. Here there was a joint effort to find a solution. But you say outside the realms of science, we didn't see that to the extent that you would have wanted to see.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't see any kind of global leadership emerging, any kind of global plan of action. Like if you thought there'll be some, a global headquarters to coordinate How in the first few months of the pandemic, when it was just beginning to spread from China, it was like watching a train accident in slow motion or something, or as the Titanic sinking in slow motion. Like everybody was sitting and seeing on television what's happening, and no adults in the room. No global leadership coming and saying, hey, we can actually stop it from spreading. We have the technology, we have the knowledge, we just need to unite. And no, people were just watching how it happens. And that was very disheartening, because if we can't unite against a virus, how are we to unite against much bigger and more complicated global problems like climate change, or like the rise of these new disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, and so forth? That's going to be much, much more difficult.
Maybe if we do try to end with an optimistic note, maybe the message should be that, as the saying goes, the change begins in us. We cannot rely maybe on these global leaders to do the job for us, and each and every one of us should decide how to live their lives in a way that would promote solidarity, more responsibility, and compassion.
Yes, except I would agree with what Yuval said earlier, that we do need institutions that we can trust. If you take climate change as an overriding problem more serious than COVID, then we can only do that if we have institutions where nations get together, as we have a world of sovereign nations, and agree to make cuts as long as other nations are making those cuts, and work out something, as the Paris Agreement was a moderately successful attempt to do so. Anyway, not a complete failure, at least. So I think that it's not really enough to say, okay, well, I'm going to ride my bike more. I'm going to put some solar panels on my roof. That's good, but I think we need to do more. We need governments to change the incentives to have clean energy. We also need to stop eating as much meat, particularly beef and lamb, as they come from ruminants who emit more greenhouse gases. And I think we do need to do this in a collective way. I don't think we're going to solve it individually.
Yeah, I agree. I think that individual action is important, but 50 people who work together in an organization are far, far more effective than 1,000 individual activists, each doing their own thing. So, you can't solve everything. Don't kind of be overwhelmed. Choose one cause and choose it really with compassion. The key thing is really to help and not to fight with the other side of something. Choose one cause with real compassion, and then join an organization that works to alleviate suffering on this front.
And I would like to thank you both for these very important messages and a thought-provoking conversation. Professor פיטר סינגר, Professor יובל הררי, thank you both for this conversation. And of course, thank you also to משכנות שאננים and the Cónrad Adenauer Stiftung in Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liad, too, for hosting the conversation, making sure it ran.
With great pleasure.